Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. A striking visual montage unfolds. Sweeping views of untamed wilderness, jagged mountains silhouetted against the sky, dense forests stretching to the horizon, and dust-covered wagons inching across the plains. You see log cabins nestled in isolation, settlers braving harsh weather, and fleeting glimpses of Native American life, some tense, others cooperative. The scenery is raw and vast, capturing both the beauty and danger of the westward American frontier. But then comes the challenge. Think frontier life was all cowboys and saloons? Think again. It's a call to look past the Hollywood versions and dime novels that often blur the line between fiction and fact. The American frontier wasn't just gunslinging outlaws or dusty towns filled with gambling halls. It was a complex, ever-changing boundary where cultures collided, families struggled to survive, and ordinary people carved out lives under extraordinary circumstances. In American history, the term frontier referred to the shifting edge of European American settlement. It was more than just a place. It was a process, a moving line that marked the advancement of colonization westward. From the Appalachian Mountains to the Pacific coast, this idea of the frontier symbolized opportunity, freedom, and rugged individualism. But it also meant dislocation, violence, backbreaking labor, and isolation. This video will take you deep into the truth of frontier life, far beyond the legends. You'll see the hardships that shaped people's days, the diverse communities that made up the frontier, the dangers they faced, and the myths that still cling to this pivotal chapter in American history. Through real stories and grounded analysis, we'll uncover what it truly meant to live on the edge of a young and growing nation. The American frontier was both a physical space and a powerful cultural idea. Geographically, it referred to the ever-shifting boundary between settled lands and the vast, largely uncolonized territories to the west. This edge was not fixed. It moved steadily over time, beginning in the dense forests of the Atlantic coast and pushing westward through the Appalachians, across the Ohio Valley, into the Great Plains, over the Rocky Mountains, and finally to the Pacific Ocean. At each stage, the frontier marked the edge of American expansion, where settlers met wilderness, indigenous nations, and untamed terrain. Culturally, the frontier symbolized something far more profound. It was seen as the proving ground of American character, where courage, independence, self-reliance, and ingenuity were forged. This idea became deeply embedded in the national identity, shaping how Americans saw themselves and their nation's purpose. The frontier represented hope and hardship, freedom and danger, promise and conflict. The timeline of the frontier stretches from the early 1600s, when European settlers first began carving out new communities along the Atlantic seaboard, through centuries of westward movement. The colonial frontiers in places like Virginia and Massachusetts eventually gave way to settlements in the Ohio Valley during the 1700s. By the early 1800s, Americans had their sights on the Mississippi River, and by mid-century, pioneers were crossing the Great Plains in search of land, gold, or simply a new life. The journey continued across the Rockies and into California and the Pacific Northwest. By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier officially closed, no longer a distinct line of settlement. But by then, it had already become a legend. A key driver of this relentless push westward was the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were divinely destined to spread their civilization across the entire continent. This ideology justified expansion at all costs and encouraged settlers to push beyond known borders, regardless of the consequences for the native peoples or the environment. Manifest destiny wasn't just a slogan, it was a call to action that defined 19th century American politics, fueled military conflicts, and shaped the nation's territorial ambitions. The frontier, in this sense, was more than land. It was the battleground where the future of America was imagined and fought for. Life on the frontier wasn't just shaped by rugged men with rifles. It was built by a diverse and often overlooked collection of people who came for different reasons and faced different challenges. Settlers made up the largest group: farmers who cleared forests to plant crops, trappers who hunted for fur in remote wilderness, miners who chased gold and silver through harsh landscapes, and ex-soldiers who tried to turn their war-earned skills into a peaceful livelihood. Many of these individuals saw the frontier as a fresh start, a place where hard work could lead to land ownership and self-sufficiency. Women and children were essential to frontier life, even though their contributions are often left out of the popular narrative. Women not only managed households, but also worked in the fields, raised livestock, defended homes during attacks, and served as healers and teachers. Life was equally demanding for children, who were expected to help with chores from a young age and often had limited access to formal education. Their labor helped families survive the brutal realities of life on the edge. For Native American tribes, the frontier was not a new opportunity, it was home. Generations had lived on and shaped these lands long before settlers arrived. As American expansion moved westward, Native tribes were often forced to choose between resistance and adaptation. Some tried to coexist through trade and negotiation, while others resisted violently, defending their territories against broken treaties and military invasions. Tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, and Comanche fought bitterly to preserve their way of life, but they faced relentless pressure from settlers, soldiers, and government policies designed to remove them. The frontier also became a destination for immigrants and freed African Americans who hoped to escape persecution and poverty. German, Irish, Scandinavian, and Chinese immigrants played major roles in building railroads, mining towns, and new communities. Freed African Americans, especially after the Civil War, moved west to seek freedom, land, and safety from racial violence in the South. Some founded all-black towns or worked as cowhands, homesteaders, or soldiers in the Buffalo Soldiers regiments. Together, these groups created a complex, often conflicted, and deeply human picture of life on the frontier. It wasn't a single story. It was thousands of overlapping ones, filled with courage, struggle, and survival on the very edge of a changing nation. Daily life on the American frontier was a relentless test of endurance, creativity, and self-reliance. For most settlers, the first and most urgent task was building shelter, often from whatever materials were available. In wooded regions, families constructed log cabins with hand-hewn timber, using mud and moss to seal the gaps. On the treeless prairies of the Great Plains, settlers resorted to sod houses, stacking thick slabs of earth to create walls. These homes were dark, cramped, and vulnerable to weather, but they were critical for survival in the harsh and unpredictable frontier environment. Securing food was a daily priority. Families relied on a combination of hunting, farming, and gathering. Men hunted deer, rabbits, or buffalo when available, while women planted small gardens and preserved whatever they could. For winter, frontier meals were simple and repetitive: cornbread, beans, salt pork, and whatever could be grown or caught. Without nearby stores, nearly everything had to be made by hand, from butter to candles to clothing. Frontier women spun wool, stitched clothes, and improvised remedies using herbs and plants. Tools were scarce and highly valued. Settlers learned to repair or repurpose them instead of replacing them. Self-reliance wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity. If a wagon wheel broke, you fixed it. If your axe dulled, you sharpened it. From growing food to building fences, to crafting furniture, nearly every skill was performed by the family unit. The frontier left little room for specialization. Survival demanded that everyone, including children, take on multiple roles and responsibilities. Despite the isolation, settlers created strong social bonds whenever possible. Religion played a central role in maintaining morale and identity. Traveling preachers visited rural communities, holding services in barns or open fields. When possible, small churches were built and became centers for worship and community gatherings. Schoolhouses, often single-room buildings, were among the first public structures in a new settlement. Education was basic, focusing on reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it was seen as a crucial step toward building a better future for children. Weather added another layer of hardship. Summers could bring droughts and insect swarms, while winters were bitter and deadly. Blizzards and prairie fires were constant threats, and storms could destroy crops or collapse fragile homes. Isolation amplified these struggles. Many families lived miles from their nearest neighbor. Communication was slow, and medical help was often non-existent. The psychological toll of such solitude was real. Depression, anxiety, and loneliness haunted many pioneers, especially women, who were frequently separated from any kind of social network. Yet through all this, frontier life produced a culture of grit, determination, and community spirit. It was a way of life that demanded sacrifice, but also offered the dream of building something lasting in a land full of unknowns. Every log raised, every field plowed, every child taught was a small act of defiance against nature, and a small victory for the human spirit. Danger was a constant companion on the American frontier, woven into nearly every aspect of daily life. While popular stories often dramatize shootouts and cowboy duels, the real threats were far more complex, persistent, and often deeply misunderstood. One of the most serious and ongoing conflicts was between settlers and Native American tribes. As American expansion pushed westward, it brought settlers directly into lands long inhabited by indigenous peoples. These encounters were not always hostile. There were periods of trade, cooperation, and even mutual respect. But too often, they ended in violence. Many native tribes were defending their homes, cultures, and ways of life against displacement and broken treaties. From the Powhatan Wars in the east to the Great Sioux War in the west, countless conflicts erupted as the U.S. government and its settlers encroached on tribal lands. These were not one-sided stories of savage attacks, as they were often portrayed in the 19th century, but rather complex clashes between people with competing visions of land, identity, and survival. Beyond human conflict, lawlessness plagued the frontier. In many remote areas, there were few sheriffs, marshals, or legal systems to maintain order. Bandits and outlaws took advantage of the chaos, robbing stagecoaches, raiding small towns, or extorting isolated homesteads. Famous names like Jesse James and Billy the Kid became legendary, but thousands of lesser-known criminals roamed the frontier unchecked. For settlers, justice was often a matter of local militias or vigilante groups, quick decisions made with limited information and little legal oversight. It was a world where disputes could escalate quickly and where survival sometimes depended on being armed and ready. Nature, however, was perhaps the most relentless threat of all. Wild animals like bears, mountain lions, wolves, and venomous snakes were real dangers, especially for families living deep in the wilderness. Diseases, especially cholera, dysentery, and smallpox, spread quickly through unsanitary conditions and limited medical knowledge. Frontier doctors were few and often undertrained, relying on rudimentary tools and homemade remedies. Epidemics could devastate entire communities, especially in the winter months when travel was impossible. The weather itself was a formidable enemy. Harsh winters trapped families in their homes for months, with snow piling up against doors and firewood running low. Blizzards could strike with little warning, blinding travelers and freezing livestock. Summers brought wildfires, lightning storms, and droughts that ruined crops and sparked desperation. Even something as simple as a broken bone or infected cut could become life-threatening when help was miles or days away. Despite these dangers, frontier communities found ways to adapt. Neighbors banded together for protection, built informal justice systems, and passed on vital knowledge about how to survive the wild. The constant presence of danger made the bonds between people stronger and helped forge the fiercely independent spirit that came to define the American frontier. But make no mistake, life on the frontier was a gamble against nature, conflict, and chaos, and not everyone survived. Getting around and staying in touch on the frontier was a challenge that shaped every aspect of life. Transportation was slow, dangerous, and often uncomfortable, but it was also essential for survival and expansion. One of the most iconic methods of travel was the wagon train. Families and individuals traveled in large groups of covered wagons, especially along famous routes like the Oregon Trail. These journeys could last months, crossing thousands of miles of rough terrain, rivers, and mountains. Travelers faced exhaustion, injury, disease, and the constant threat of accidents. Yet for many, it was the only way to reach new land and a new life in the West. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a path, it was a lifeline that connected the settled East with the promise of the West. Alongside it were other major routes like the Santa Fe Trail and the California Trail, each serving different regions and destinations. These roads were primitive at best, often little more than rutted tracks carved through wilderness. Bridges were rare, maps were unreliable, and travelers depended heavily on guides, instincts, and luck. Communication on the frontier was just as limited. Before the telegraph and railroad networks expanded, sending a letter from one part of the country to another could take weeks or even months. For a brief time in the 1860s, the Pony Express provided a faster, though still risky, method of communication. Young riders on horseback raced across the West, changing mounts at way stations to deliver mail with impressive speed. Despite its romantic image, the Pony Express lasted less than 2 years, eventually replaced by more efficient, system stagecoaches were another key part of frontier infrastructure. They carried passengers, mail, and sometimes gold between remote settlements, bouncing over rough roads and across dangerous terrain. These journeys were long, cramped, and dusty, but they connected frontier towns to the outside world. Armed, guards often rode along to protect against bandits or hostile encounters. The most revolutionary change came with the expansion of the railroad. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 transformed frontier life by making travel and communication faster, cheaper, and more reliable. Goods could be shipped across the country, people could migrate more easily, and newspapers and mail could arrive in days rather than weeks. Railroads didn't just change how people moved, they reshaped entire towns, turning once remote outposts into thriving trade centers and accelerating the pace of settlement. Still, for much of the frontier period, isolation was the norm. News of elections, wars, or even family births and deaths might take months to arrive. This delay left many settlers feeling disconnected from the rest of the country. The slowness of communication deepened the sense that the frontier was a world apart, untamed, uncertain, and always one step removed from the modern nation it was slowly becoming a part of. On the frontier, innovation wasn't a luxury, it was a survival strategy. Life in remote, often unforgiving environments forced settlers to find creative solutions to daily challenges. With limited access to manufactured goods, tools, or skilled professionals, frontier families had to invent, adapt, and build nearly everything from scratch. One of the most transformative technological breakthroughs was barbed wire. Introduced in the 1870s, this simple yet powerful invention revolutionized farming and ranching. Before barbed wire, fencing large areas of land was nearly impossible on the open plains. Wood was scarce, and traditional fencing was expensive and labor-intensive. Barbed wire made it possible to enclose land quickly and cheaply, allowing settlers to protect crops from wandering cattle and clearly mark property boundaries. It dramatically altered the open-range system and helped usher in a new era of organized agriculture. Another vital innovation was the steel plow, famously improved by John Deere. Earlier wooden plows couldn't cut through the thick, root-filled prairie soil, making farming nearly impossible in some areas. The steel plow, with its durability and sharp edge, allowed farmers to till land that had previously resisted cultivation. This opened vast new areas for agriculture and made farming on the frontier more efficient and productive. Windmills, too, became essential tools, especially in the arid Great Plains. They pumped water from underground wells, providing life-sustaining water for crops, livestock, and families. These wind-driven machines allowed settlers to survive in places where surface water was scarce or seasonal, turning previously uninhabitable land into productive homesteads. But frontier ingenuity went far beyond tools and machines. With little outside help, settlers had to become self-taught experts in everything: medicine, carpentry, blacksmithing, and education. Home remedies, often passed down through generations, were used to treat everything from fevers to broken bones. Construction relied on improvisation and collaboration, with entire communities gathering for barn raisings and house building. These events were as much social gatherings as they were practical necessities, reinforcing community bonds and ensuring that no one was left to struggle alone. Trading posts and general stores served as economic and social hubs, where settlers could barter goods, share news, and buy essential supplies. In some areas, cooperatives formed, community-based networks where members pooled resources to buy equipment, share harvests, or support each other through hard seasons. These early forms of grassroots organization helped level the playing field and offered a measure of economic security in an unpredictable world. The spirit of frontier innovation wasn't about cutting-edge science. It was about making do with what you had, turning hardship into opportunity, and leaning on creativity when resources were scarce. Whether it was inventing new tools, building homemade solutions, or relying on community collaboration, frontier ingenuity helped shape not just survival, but the very identity of the American pioneer experience. The American frontier has long lived in the popular imagination as a land of fearless cowboys, high-noon gunfights, dusty saloons, and heroic loners riding into the sunset. Hollywood and dime novels crafted a thrilling version of the wild West that became embedded in American culture, but this romanticized image often bears little resemblance to the reality of frontier life. One of the biggest myths is the idea of the gunslinger, the lone cowboy settling disputes with a pistol on a dusty street. In truth, such dramatic shootouts were extremely rare. Most frontier towns had strict gun laws, and many disputes were resolved through negotiation, community judgment, or were simply avoided out of necessity. Daily life required cooperation far more than conflict. The image of the quick-draw cowboy overshadowed the actual experience of settlers, where survival depended on hard labor, neighborly support, and shared effort. Hollywood also painted the cowboy as a noble, often white figure taming the wild land. In reality, the people who worked as cowboys were incredibly diverse. Many were Mexican vaqueros, African Americans, and Native Americans. Cowboy work was grueling, herding cattle for long hours, enduring harsh weather, sleeping rough, and facing dangers from stampedes or rustlers. It was far less glamorous and far more physically punishing than the silver screen suggested. The idea of the West as a land of constant excitement and heroic conquest ignores the day-to-day grind most pioneers faced. Settlers spent their days farming, building, and struggling against weather, isolation, and illness. Instead of action-packed adventures, life was a slow, demanding routine marked by uncertainty and endurance. The freedom often associated with the frontier came at the price of immense personal risk and backbreaking work. Even the idea of the frontier as a lawless, wild territory is somewhat misleading. While some areas lacked formal law enforcement, communities quickly developed their own systems of order, forming vigilance committees, electing sheriffs, or creating local rules to maintain peace. The need for stability often outweighed the thrill of rebellion. This romanticization of the West served a purpose. It offered Americans a national myth of rugged individualism and manifest destiny. It symbolized opportunity, freedom, and adventure. But in doing so, it also erased the complexities of the frontier, the displacement of native peoples, the contributions of minorities and women, and the sheer difficulty of carving out a life in an untamed land. The truth of the frontier is far more compelling than the myth. It's a story of grit over glory, of families scraping by with limited resources, of entire communities built from cooperation, not conflict. By peeling back the myths, we gain a richer, more honest understanding of the people and experiences that shaped one of the most iconic chapters in American history. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau made a historic declaration. The American frontier was officially closed. This didn't mean the land was fully settled or that expansion had stopped, but rather that there was no longer a clear, continuous line marking the boundary between civilized settlement and the wild, unsettled West. This moment symbolized the end of an era, one that had defined the American experience for nearly 3 centuries. The closing of the frontier marked a turning point in how Americans saw themselves. For generations, the frontier had represented possibility. It was a place where people could start over, claim land, and carve out a life through determination and hard work. With its end, the U.S. faced a new reality. There were no more vast, unexplored frontiers within the country's borders. The sense of infinite opportunity that had driven westward expansion had to evolve. Yet the spirit of the frontier didn't disappear. It became deeply embedded in American identity. The values associated with frontier life, rugged individualism, resilience, and self-reliance, continued to shape how Americans viewed themselves and their nation. These ideals fed into powerful national myths, influencing everything from politics to education and even foreign policy. The belief in manifest destiny gave way to a broader sense of American exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. had a unique role to play on the world stage. The legacy of the frontier also lives on in folklore, literature, and popular culture. From cowboy novels and Western films to frontier-themed TV shows and rodeos, the West became a backdrop for stories about bravery, freedom, and defiance. Figures like Davy Crockett, Buffalo Bill, and Annie Oakley were transformed into larger-than-life characters, blending fact and fiction to keep the frontier spirit alive long after its official end. Politically, the frontier ideal continues to resonate. Politicians often invoke the language of pioneers, talking about frontier spirit, breaking new ground, or blazing trails, to inspire innovation or justify bold action. This imagery has extended beyond the geographic West, influencing everything from the space race to modern startup culture. Even today, Americans are drawn to the idea of being pioneers, whether in technology, business, or social change. But the end of the frontier also forced a reckoning. It brought attention to the consequences of westward expansion, the displacement and suffering of Native American communities, the environmental cost of unchecked settlement, and the social inequalities that persisted even on the so-called land of opportunity. Ultimately, the closing of the frontier didn't end its influence. Instead, it shifted the frontier from a physical place to a powerful symbol, one that continues to shape America's national story. The real frontier may be gone, but its echoes are still heard in the country's culture, politics, and identity today. The American frontier was far more than just a backdrop for dramatic tales. It was a complex, challenging, and transformative chapter in the nation's history. From the rugged landscapes and diverse peoples to the daily struggles and innovative spirit, frontier life demanded resilience, cooperation, and courage. It shaped American identity, embedding values like self-reliance and determination that still resonate today. While the myths of gunfights and lone heroes capture the imagination, the true story reveals communities built on hard work, adaptation, and mutual support. Reflecting on the frontier experience, we can see timeless lessons in perseverance and creativity when faced with adversity. The pioneer's ability to innovate, band together, and endure harsh conditions reminds us of the strength found in both individual grit and collective effort, a message that remains relevant in today's fast-changing world. If you found this journey through the frontier fascinating, stay tuned for our next video, Frontier Women, the Forgotten Pioneers, where we'll uncover the vital, yet often overlooked roles women played in shaping the American West. If you found this glimpse into real frontier life eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an adventure into history. Now, we want to hear from you. Would you have survived on the frontier? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.